Hi, I'm Charlene Jorgensen and welcome to Quilting from the Heartland. Today I'm going to show you how to make the star flower design. When creating this quilt, the more color you use, the better you will like it. When collecting fabrics for this design, to get ideas for the color, I like to look at birds of feathers. The brighter the better. You might also look at flowers in the garden or even colors of the rainbow. All will give you ideas of how you might want to put colors together. One thing you want to keep in mind when collecting fabrics for this quilt is that you use fabrics without a lot of texture in them. Because if you used, for example, a large floral print, each of the pieces would read differently in the end results. The brighter the fabrics on both ends of the melon, the better I also like them. The fabric used in the background in this one was a black on black, also without very much texture. It's even like a marbleized fabric. Notice that the quilting in the background is a continuous line diamond design filled with a meandering. This quilting was done with a sulky magenta thread. The second example that I'm showing you has a different texture in the background of the quilt. A lot of the colors are similar except for the black in the feather. I will refer to the melon as a feather. And the background in the majority of the background has a different texture in it. Otherwise, there are a lot of similarities in both designs. Again, notice that they both have real bright fabrics used in them. In front of me, you'll get a closer look at the fabrics before I started to cut them. And I like to lay them out in the order that they're going to go into the design so that I'm sure I like them all together. The background fabric, then after I've chosen the fabrics for the melon, I lay that over and notice how it just pops out all of the different fabrics in the design. Before I start cutting all the fabrics, I wash them in a washer using a soap that doesn't have any bleaching additives, and then dry them in the dryer. And then the last thing I do before I start cutting is starching the fabric with a mixture of 50% water and 50% Stay-Flow. Stay-Flow is a liquid starch that you can get at your grocery store. Now the fabrics are numbered from 1 to 6, and I'll lay them back down again. This would be fabric 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 1 and 6 fabric are cut into strips 2 inches wide. Ahead of time, I have straightened these two fabrics, so that's ready to go. And we will turn them around now so that we're ready to cut the strips. You will line up the straightened edge of the fabric with the 2-inch line on the ruler. And when cutting with the rotary cutter, I like to use or hold the cutter so that my pointer finger is up at the end of the cutter rather than holding it like this. I find that I have more control when I do it that way. Like I always do, I go backwards first and then forward. And as I move along that strip, I move my hand to the other end of the fabric. That now will be fabrics 1 and 6. Fabrics 2, 3, 4, and 5 will be cut all at the same time because you use 1.5-inch strips from all of those. We will line them up on top of each other. So we can cut them all at the same time, matching the folded edge to the folded edge, then shake them out, and we will straighten them all at the same time. And fold the excess fabric up on top of the board so you don't disturb it after it's been cut. Line up one edge of the ruler with the folded edge. Now if you find it hard to cut through that many layers of fabric, maybe you want to just do 2 at a time. But now we have straightened actually 8 layers of fabric. Turn the board without disturbing the fabric, and these strips now will be cut 1.5 inches wide. So line up the straightened edge of the fabric with the 1.5 inch line on the ruler. Now we have a set of strips enough for one combination to sew together. I guess I needed to push a little bit harder with the rotary cutter. Now let's arrange them to go into the sewn strips. And I'm going to lay out a set of strips that have already been sewn together. And notice how we have alternated the angle. So half of the strips are sewn with the 45 in this direction and the other half in this direction. We will, when you sew these together, after you have sewn them, you will finger press all of the seams open. In the past, when I have taught this class, I have pressed half of the seam allowance in one direction and the other half in the opposite direction. But I have found with this technique that my patchwork will lay a lot flatter. Now I want to move to the flannel board and show you something that happens when we don't cut them in the right direction. The end result is to have all of our melons looking the same. Now when we cut strips from the combinations down on the table, there are 2 ways that you can sew them together. Look at what happens when you sew them this way. Then we end up with a different looking end down here, which is the reverse of this. If you sew them this way together, you'll end up with a melon that looks exactly like this. So you need to make sure that when you cut these sewn strips apart, that you cut them in the right angle. And when these are flipped in the way that they're going to be sewn together, you can check to see that your work is correct. This would be the wrong way. So now we will do it this way. Double check. This is going to be the right way. So I will cut the strip going in this direction. Now I'm going to lay the cut combinations of strips up on top of the board, and each of these are going to be cut 2 inches wide. You got to lay the 45-degree angle mark on the ruler on one of the sewn edges. But I need to turn it this way, I'm sorry. You line up the 45-degree angle line on one of the seams, and the straightened edge of your fabric is on the 2-inch line of your ruler. Now you want to make sure that you've done them all the same, and when I lay this back up here, that's reassuring to know that I have done it in the correct way, because we don't want half of them to look one way and the other half another way. Now when cutting these strips, sometimes they won't always line up on the 45-degree angle line after you've cut a few, because when you've sewn them they probably will create a curve. So you'll have to re-straighten this edge over here before you continue on to cut. Now half of your pieces will come from this piece, and the other half will come from this one. Again, lining up that 45-degree angle line with the seam line and cutting it 2 inches wide. Now notice that isn't entirely perfect, so what I would want to do, like I said earlier, is straighten that edge before I cut it. So you would line up the line down here and see how it's narrower there than it is down here. So you want to straighten that edge. That's very important in this design. The 45-degree angle there, and straighten this edge. Now go back and check it again, and now it will be straight, and you can continue to cut off the next piece that's needed. The next part to this, what did I do with the piece I cut before? Here it is. Remember how I said if you lay them this way, your end result will be different than if it were like this. We will be sewing these together at the sewing machine, and that's the part I'll do over there. But I want to show you now how we actually get the melon from this part right here. I like to use a small mat board when doing this part of the cutting, so that I can easily turn my work. Ahead of time, I have scored my template in 2 places, halfway through the middle in both directions. I will match this score line with the center point of the melon here, and the tip of the melon will be matched up with the seam line. Because all of the seams have been pressed open, it lays nice and flat, and I don't have that rocking motion like I used to have when I pressed the seams in opposite directions. When you line up the points of the template like this with the seam line, every piece will be cut exactly the same size. You can only cut one at a time because it really would be impossible to line up 2 pieces like this on top of each other and end up with perfect melons. Now notice how when we've done it this way, how the point comes here. If I had sewn it together the wrong way, this would have ended up to be the point. So you do want to have them all the same in your quilt. The other thing that I want to show you how to sew or to cut before we go to the sewing machine is the background piece that goes into this design. Ahead of time, I have folded the fabric in half and then in half again, and I don't want to use the selvage edge over here, so I will lay the template up just on this side of it, because you never want to use the selvage edge in your quilt. I will allow plenty of room so I can turn the whole board as I cut around the template. I always prefer to use a small rotary cutter rather than a large one, because the blades on the big cutter are way too big to follow the curves. We have fabric grips on the corner, and that keeps them from slipping. Now we have completed cutting 4 at a time, which happen to be the background of the star flower design. Well, now I think we're ready to go to the sewing machine and start putting the pieces together. I will sew all of the seams today with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that will make up for the fabric used in the seam line. The reason I do that is because all of the pattern shapes have the 1/4 inch seam allowance included in them, but you still have to make up for that tiny bit of fabric used in the seam line. Remember now that we want to sew these together correctly, so I will put these right sides together. And to sew these seams, all of the seam allowances have been pressed open. Insert your pin right on the seam line, 1/4 of an inch from the edge through the top and the bottom. Snug it up, and then I like to put a pin alongside it at an angle the same way that the piece was sewn. We'll do a couple more of these. See how I put it at the same angle as the seam line? Stab it exactly, well, as close as you can to 1/4 of an inch from the edge. I like to use silk pins because I find that the accuracy is increased with them. The shaft is only a 5mm, which makes it easier to slip them into the fabric. And sometimes it is necessary to sew over them, so there are many reasons why I like to use them. Now, no back stitching. Guiding the fabric with the stiletto in front of the presser foot. I like to use cotton thread for all of my quilting. It has the same thickness as the fibers in the cotton fabric, so it matches it for strength. And then we'll move off or sew off onto an anchor cloth. The next part then would be to finger press that seam open, and then we would have the piece that I showed you earlier that we cut apart. See how easy that goes together? And I won't take the time to actually cut another one, but that's how you would make the patchwork before you cut the melons from them. Now you need to identify the center part of the background piece, and I have folded into 4 equal parts, and I've put a little notch on all 4 sides. That way I know where the center point is. You also need to do that with the melon part. You need to fold it in half, and technically, if you have cut it accurately, the little notch comes right next to the seam line of the center piece in your flower or your feather or whatever you want to call it. Match up the notches of the melon and the background and put the smile on top or the concave on top. Insert a pin in the center to hold it in place. And now to match up the end, insert a pin 1/4 of an inch from the edge, equal distance on all 3 edges, and then right on the seam line. And go 1/4 of an inch from the edge, not from the point, because this distance would be greater than if you went from the edge. And sometimes if someone will call and say, I'm having trouble getting the melon on, I will ask them, did you measure from the point or did you go from the edge? Now notice that when I move this into a match, I don't have to clip anything. It just moves right into a match there. Then on the other end, insert a pin there and go out to the end here. And again, we will move it into a match without clipping or easing anything. It's a perfect match. Now when I sew this seam, I will guide the fabric with the stiletto. If you don't, sometimes the top fabric will move too far to the left or too far to the right. That will guarantee me a perfect seam every time. Also, you back stitch to this point and go to this end and back stitch. After you have put one of these on, it's just repetitive throughout the whole quilt. You attach them as if you see the rows here, and then the size of your quilt is determined by the number of melons in the rows, and also of course the number of rows you put together will determine the length of it. I sure hope you've enjoyed watching the star flower go together today. I've enjoyed making it for you.